Everybody. Welcome to Unlearning Economics. We are a little bit late, so sorry about that. We had some technical issues, but I am very happy to be here with Matt Darling. And Matt is an employment policy fellow at the Niskanen Centre. Also used to work at the behavioural economics lab Ideas 42, which is a really interesting place. They apply behavioral economics to social and policy issues. So overall, I'd class Matt as a behavioral and labour economist. Is that fair to say, Matt?
Yeah, that's fair. These days, a little bit more labor than behavioral. A funny thing is, I feel like a lot of the insights I end up bringing to labor market conversations is almost like anti-behavioral economics. Like a lot of times, the way people invoke behavioral economics is to say like, oh, maybe poor people are just bad at doing things, and I go and say no, like poor people are probably like reacting to rational incentives. And you almost have to know a lot of behavioral economics to like dispute that. But it's sort of it's been an interesting transition moving from one to the other. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's some super interesting questions to ask about rational behavior and what constitutes rational behavior and how people's so-called rationality can change in response to different incentives. And in response to different environments. But I mean, we may get to that later if we have time. But to be honest, we all know why we're here. I know why
Really,
there's
I like the title of this. Yeah.
I know why there's 164 people in the chat instantly, which isn't usual, by the way, for me. It's normally below 100 at first, and it peaks at 200. It is now already 200. You owned Jordan Peterson online. That's what we're all interested in, right? You owned Jordan Peterson online. That's what we're all interested in, right? I think you're just replaying me there, Matt.
Yeah. Sorry, I just opened up the thing. So you mentioned the
Yeah,
chat.
no, it's good because you can see the chat if you do that. So yeah, that's a good thing to do.
Yeah.
Anyway, yes, please talk us through the whole thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and it's sort of funny because this is like it's something that happened 4 years ago, and I feel like being like nowadays, like owning Jordan Peterson online is a cottage industry, right? There's probably whole YouTube channels that's their entire thing. But like 4 years ago was right after his book came out, right? The first book, 12 Rules for Life. And we were sort of like in the height of Jordan Peterson mania. And I don't think and so he's just getting constantly brought up in every conversation. And I don't think anyone had like really like effectively combated him before that, right? It just wasn't a big thing. And you can still hear me, right? I'm just making sure.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think it's all fine now.
Okay, just double checking. So this is again 4 years ago, and he, as so many people do when they're doing their book club or their book gets released, he did an AMA on Reddit. And Reddit at the time, I was spending a lot of my time on Reddit, and I'd spent basically like a lot of time from like 2010 to 2020, I would say, like just commenting on Reddit, having sessions about economics on Reddit, basically almost from the financial crisis to the COVID crisis, and in terms of how I was doing it.
Can I just butt in and ask how did spending all that time on Reddit affect you?
I don't know what the counterfactual is, but like, I think it was an interesting thing to do because it does, you spend a lot of time talking to people about economics, you get interested in it. The same way that it works for you on like YouTube is you say, okay, like here's like a way of discussing this sort of thing. I ended up one of the very specific narrow things that I kind of got obsessed with was talking to people about the gender wage gap, and specifically like if you think about like your modal Reddit user who is a 24-year-old engineer libertarian type guy, nothing wrong with that. but like are usually people who have like very strong opinions on the gender wage gap and don't necessarily have a big argument about the economics of it. And similarly, like a lot of folks, like I spent a lot of the time at the very beginning, like arguing with like Ron Paul type people about like how the financial crisis was going to work and everything like that. And I got really interested in this because there's sort of like this, it's this thing that comes up, the gender wage gap, in lots of conversations, lots of sort of like culture war conversations. But, you can actually go and think about and talk about it from strictly the point of view of this sort of very narrow lens of how to do, good causal inference. And what's sort of funny is like this, Jordan Peterson had this like interview with I think her name's Kathy Newman, and it was like one of the most viral things I've ever seen. And Jordan Peterson had this one comment in where she's like, oh, like the gender wage gap is 20%, and he's like, aha, that's actually the univariate analysis. You need to do a multivariate analysis. And and the great thing about that quote is it sounds like he's doing this like incredibly complicated math or this incredibly complicated sophisticated thing. And it's actually close to precisely the opposite. There's, if you actually take a lot of sophisticated econometrics classes, a lot of causal inference classes, you spend a lot of time talking about, what's called bad controls. My sort of Bible for this is Angerson and Pischke's mostly harmless econometrics, which basically like goes through talking about precisely this thing where it's like, hey, if you were doing, a regression, I think they were doing it on. They talk about it in the context of like education. If you're trying to figure out like the college wage premium, like, oh, you shouldn't, put occupational controls in that because they're, not just they're not a pre-existing variable that's free floating, but it's something that's actually determined by other factors that you actually care about. So it ends up being, you don't want to use controls that aren't fixed, conceptually fixed at the time where the variable you're interested in has been randomly assigned one or the other, or the regressor of interest is determined. Now, when you're talking about gender, gender or sex, the best sort of way of thinking about it is like maybe defined at birth. Obviously, it can differ for people who are trans or anything like that. But like it's definitely no matter what, it's definitely before someone maybe starts school or thinks about their occupation. So Jordan Peterson doing this AMA, and I just sort of asked him about these things. And my general take on how I participate on Twitter and Reddit is try to be like really backbendingly polite, just be really really calm and everything like that. And I pointed out two arguments and errors in his arguments that he makes fairly frequently. One, the bad control issue that I just mentioned. And the second one, where he was like, hey, what happens if you double the labor force? You'd have the value of labor, and of course that's that's labor's an input into GDP. It's not, you can't be like, aha, GDP is a constant. That's a classic error called the lump labor fallacy. And so I asked them, okay, here's, these two really straightforward errors that you make fairly frequently that I think, are, I think they're really intuitive, but they're also something that I feel like, you could ask these questions as, in an exam for an Econ 101 or an Econometrics 101 class, and and be like, aha, what would happen when this happens to the labor market? What would happen when you do these sorts of controls? And write a little essay about them, and they were just like sort of straightforwardly wrong. And so I asked, okay, well, so what do you do, right? Like, how do you check? You're making all these claims about labor economics, making all these claims about how statistics works, and you're actually making these really basic errors. And he never got around to asking me, but we had this like, this a back and forth about that, where he would sort of go and say, okay, here's what I think about the gender wage gap. Here's where I'm coming from. Like, okay, but I'm asking you this question. Could you get back to me on that? And he just sort of never did. And there's like sort of classic, Reddit treats people very harshly when they don't answer the questions that people are asking them. And so like he got, just furiously downvoted, and I got furiously upvoted. And again, in a way that I think was really, I had not seen that much in like 2018 at that point in time, where Jordan Peterson was sort of, at the height of his powers.
Yeah, thank you. So I think it's really interesting because he does seem to make these quite specific comments about the literature, right?
Yeah,
So, he'll say something like, you need 18 variables to explain the gender wage gap fully. He'll say like agreeableness explains 5% of it, the personality trait agreeableness. These very specific comments. And it's interesting because there was obviously a more direct way to go about asking him, and sort of saying that he was just directly wrong. But what you
mm,
were sort of doing was doing it a bit laterally and saying, well, where did these things actually come from? Why are you claiming
right,
these
right.
things when they're actually there? If you know about causal inference, which you mentioned, if you know about like labor economics, then they're not true, and it's not clear where they're coming from.
Yeah, yeah. Like you could go, you could like, I mean, your video did a great job of this, where you're like, okay, here's this paper he cited, and here's the what was the corrigendum to the paper, like go into those sorts of details. But like you can also just point out those sorts of like fairly basic errors, and like I do some sort of interdisciplinary work. As I mentioned, I'm a behavioral economist. But like, and so every once in a while, I tread into sociology or psychology, and I'm sure I make errors when I do that.
Mm.
But like, I'm not necessarily doing it in front of an audience of millions. The interdisciplinary work is really, really hard. And I think one thing that's always tricky about this with Peterson, especially, is like I think Peterson's actually like a very good, psychologist in this sort of way. Like if you look at his academic literature, what he does is he does a lot of work on like what determines personality, how do people, what are the correlates with dispositions, and so he sort of thinks about it from that sort of way. And what's tricky about that is that, like, the very different way than I think you have to think about it when you're thinking about like labor economics stuff. You have to really be thinking about, okay, people are agents, they're making decisions out there in the world, they're responding to incentives, and not just sort of, say, okay, how do we predict these sorts of things? There's I'll throw some technical terms at this, but like, there's things you can try to figure out, which is like, trying to predict something, which, in economics you'd call like the R squares. Can you actually say, okay, here's a regression that perfectly predicts the variable that we're interested in, and actually figuring out the causal claims, the causal underlying of something, or, which is like figuring out like what we call the beta hat. Like those are actually really, really different endeavors. And Jordan Peterson's been very much like in his academic life, sort of in that R squared world, and that means that a lot of times when he moves to another domain, his intuitions are actually going to be quite bad, and I'm sure the same vice versa. If I try to move back into to do the head work that he does.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like, and we were discussing this a little bit before we went live, but it is just like the problem where that public intellectuals tend to have, where they're often asked about quite a lot of things. They're often asked to comment on a lot of different things, and they end up venturing into realms that are outside their expertise. Although in this case, I don't want to defend Jordan Peterson too much because it
Yeah.
seems he kind of wholeheartedly embraced that, right?
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, and it was funny. Like, again, I don't want to like. There's this funny thing about this, because like this was a really fun time on that Reddit discussion, and it was 4 years ago. And I don't want to like be like, oh, this time I own this celebrity. Like 10 years after. But like it was really funny because like I think one of the last things he did like in that conversation is he just like he clearly Googled like experiment showing gender wage gap is wrong, and like found this like random CBS like article about a study that had come out like a week before that actually didn't support what he was saying at all. And we've all been tempted to do this, if not do it. Where you're just like someone's telling you something, and you're like, oh, you just go and desperately look for a law, some sort of fig leaf that lets you explain how you're actually right. But yeah, it is just like doing interdisciplinary work is really, really hard. And like I would expect that especially insofar as like a lot of stuff Peterson does aim at is like he does make lots of claims about labor economics and especially how it relates to gender. And this is a huge literature. It's a really complicated literature. It's got, all sorts of great papers, great books you can read. And you
Mm.
actually have to really like sit with it a while and really think about it for a bit.
Yeah, so I want to go into some of the specifics. I mean, you mentioned them in your first answer, but I wanted to talk specifically about this issue of like controls.
Yeah.
So the JBP argument, and it's not just him; it's Joe Rogan. I don't know the
Yeah.
people that were called the intellectual dark web, online tech libertarians, like you were saying. A lot of people will tend to say that once you add things like occupation, industry, hours worked, personality, and so
Yeah.
forth, you add them all to a gender pay gap regression, regressing wages on gender, then it kind of disappears or at least greatly reduces. And the argument is therefore that it's just that men and women are different and they're doing different things, they're making different choices, right? So what
Mhm.
is the problem with that
Yeah.
argument in your opinion?
Yeah. And I'm going to try to, I know this stuff really well at the technical level, and want to
Mm,
make sure I'm not like throwing regression to but like a lot of this is about how different variables interrelate, right? And specifically, the the intuition that a lot of people have, where you can like, aha, just throw more controls into it so that you actually control for everything, ends up being not great. And it's sort of funny, like the way the sort of like, oh, you're doing univariate analysis, you should do the multivariate. Like you actually want to do the univariate because you actually want to isolate the one variable that you're interested in, and that's what like doing a lot of controls is trying to do, but it might not do it depending on the actual like causal structure. So think about it this way. So what they're saying is like, hey, there's this 25% gender wage gap between men and women, but if you actually look, women and men have very different occupations, and if you take out any effects that come from occupations, that maybe explains a lot of the difference in wages. And that's one way of looking at it. The other way to look at it is say, hey, we wages differ between men and women, and that's going to explain the difference in occupations, right? That if women are consistently going to be discriminated against in fields, if they're going to have lower wages, or as you pointed out in the video, like lower quality of work, if they're going to be harassed or discriminated against, not
mm,
in non-wage ways, well, that's going to change the occupations they're going to choose, right? And so, think about it. If let's say, there's discrimination in science, technology, engineering jobs, STEM jobs, and so women get less money, and women are, they're deciding whether they want to take that job, right? And you can't just decide to have a STEM degree, to get a STEM job. You have to have a degree. You have to study for it. You have to spend lots of money and time. A lot of engineers don't have a social life for 6 years. It's very costly. And they're going to be, and again, like this is sort of the non-behavioral economics as I was mentioning earlier, but at some level they're saying, okay, well, is this worth it, right? Are the costs worth the benefits? And the more amount of discrimination, the less likely they're going to be able to do it. Um, and people, including women, they're forward-looking, right? They're not, they don't get jobs and they're like, oh, what actually is this salary? They're deciding what careers to pursue, based at least in part on what the incentives that are facing them, and discrimination, prejudices, all those things that changes the actual payoffs that they're going to be doing. And so if and like this is really obvious stuff, right? Like the idea that women at some level are responding to what their potential salary is going to be, like that's like the most fundamental pieces of economics you can imagine, right? Like it's literally people respond to incentives when they make decisions. It's incredibly basic stuff, but once you sort of start integrating that into it, you can run into a lot of trouble, because that means that you can't, like, that thing that he's trying to do where you say, okay, put in occupation control, ends up having almost like the opposite of what he wants it to do. It can go and just like completely mess up your regression. I was thinking about. I was going to see if I can share my screen 1 second. Let's see if this actually does anything because I actually have like. Can you guys see this? Can you see this?
They can't, but what? Give me 1 second. Um, um,
I cannot do it if it's not going to work.
I don't know why that's not allowing me to click on your shared screen here. Oh, 1 second. Wait a second. No. Um, I can actually show them. I think I can have it take up the whole thing. Oh, so you've opened Stata,
Yeah.
right? Okay, here we are. Right, everybody can see it. This hooks the viewers in. Okay, so
Stata. That's my. So like this is like literally like 12 lines of code that I like made at one point, which I'm just like, hey, like so like just to show how these regressions would work, right? So like I'm setting how many observations there are, so it's 200. You know, I'm just generating some data. I'm saying half of them are female, half of them are male, and then I'm saying, okay, like getting a job in tech is costly, and I'm saying it goes from 1 to 100 and how much it costs. You're just saying, some people are smarter than others in whether it's costly or not. Setting all wages to 0 and then saying, okay, like, then saying, okay, who gets a tech job? And, if I scroll down a little bit so I can, so like, basically I'm just setting wages manually. I'm saying, okay, every, women, getting a tech job is worth twice as much, right? Both men and women, their wages go up whether in tech. But women, on average, women are going to make 0.8. They're making 20% less, right? Than men do, or point 0.5, and then say, okay, like because of that, there's these costs that people are
Matt, you
paying.
just cut out. You just cut out for a
Oh,
second there,
sorry.
and it's not displaying anymore. You're not sharing your screen anymore.
Okay. Anyways, the
Is
you
it not?
know,
Okay.
I'll sort of just jump to it.
Oh, that's here we are.
But like
No, yeah,
you can
there we
like
go.
you can literally like so basically I just set up this thing where I generated the data where I know that women have a 20% wage penalty and then said, okay, but like some women, the wage penalty is going to move them away from one sector to another. So it changes the proportion of it. And then you can actually just run the regressions and say like, aha, if you regress wage female, on this, you get 0.19, which is pretty close to the true value. We know that the true value is that women are going to make 20% less. But if
Yeah,
you add that coefficient of tech job, which again Peterson and other folks like think is going to make it more accurately, it actually biases it against it. It actually means that the regression is giving you a less accurate result because it's saying you're moving women from one sector to another, and because a lot less women pursue these jobs now, you end up having a different a the wage gap as measured with controls ends up being smaller, but it's still the exact size because we
mm.
know it's the exact size. We know what the causal pattern is because this is just data that I just generated myself.
Yeah.
Anyways, you know I'm happy.
I think it didn't like Stata for some reason. I'm not sure.
Didn't like
Discord,
data. That
maybe the people at Discord are fans or something, but
uh,
it wouldn't accept it for too long. But I think we got the point right. So basically, when you're like you pre-programmed this example, right,
right.
so that women get paid less. That's baked into what you just
We
did.
know what it is. We know exactly what it is. I'm not.
Yeah.
I'm not guessing anything. I'm not asserting anything. We're just like literally looking at it.
Yeah, exactly. So, but then what happens is if you run a regression without the control for occupation, in this case tech, it returns the actual gender pay gap that you've pre-programmed in. So that's correct. If you run it with the tech control, the control for occupation, then it returns a smaller value in magnitude, a smaller wage gap, and that's actually a wage gap which is what, it was 25% smaller or 5 percentage points smaller, and it was wrong, right? So controlling for occupation is giving you the wrong answer.
Yeah, exactly. And again, like basically, like what you're, what he's basically, doing, or with people who claim this, like you said, Ben Shapiro, Dave Rubin, your whole intellectual dark web audience, like is basically like they're they're working on the assumption, they don't even realize this because they're not statisticians, but they're working on the assumption of like women's occupational choices are fixed. That they don't respond to incentives, that they don't have any sort of causal relationship on that. And like again, that's going to be wrong. And it's going to be wrong in this way that ends up being misleading. And so like there's all these things where they say, oh, like we add and this control, and because of that, we now the gender wage gap goes from 20% to 3%. And you're like, well, that doesn't mean anything. Like that's going to happen, almost no matter what, because you're just throwing in a bunch of noise into that. And some of that noise specifically, we know is actually going to bias your data, your analysis in the exactly wrong way. So it's basically going into something like where you're doing the math is completely wrong in a way that makes it like not have a valid causal interpretation. It's the equivalent of like, this is a little bit strong, but this the analogy I use. It's like dividing by zero, right? Like when you take that math and you divide by zero and on both sides, and you end up with some goofy finding at the end where you can prove that 1+1 = 3. It's the same sort of that's the same sort of intuition you should have, is that they're doing this thing that's actually like just wrong to do at a very basic level, and then making these grandiose conclusions from it.
I mean, I wonder if it's an exaggeration to say that there's like, they're almost not thinking about economics at all, right? Because, like you said, they're sort of, they're just saying that women and men are in different occupations, and that's that. It's biology,
are born to be nurses, men are born to be doctors, or whatever, and that it's not the product of agents going around making decisions.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, it is, it's just completely ignoring a whole set of incentives or structural factors, depending on what you want to call them, that drive women's decisions. And like you said, it's if you see, if you're a woman who sees that, for example, there's a very low chance of you succeeding in STEM because of discrimination or even outright harassment or something like that, then what on average are women going to do in response to that? Well, they're probably going to steer away from STEM and towards other things.
Yeah, exactly. And like, yeah, I mean, it's something that I think is like really obviously intuitive. And like you said, the idea that it's very funny because again, I spend less time nowadays. Everyone's busy with like all economics is now COVID related, or in some level. But like it is really funny because like you sometimes go and like have these conversations with people, and you just push and push and push, and then eventually they're like, oh yeah, like they'll start saying weird things like, oh, I don't think women like know what discrimination that discrimination exists, or like what the expect. And I'm like, of course they do. Like, or even if they're like, you don't have to we were talking about this at the beginning, but like you don't have to assume they're like purely rational agents, something like that. But like all you have to have is like women who at some level observe their surroundings and make choices at some level about that, which is a really really minor claim to make.
Yeah, absolutely, and also using information probably from their own lives and things that they've experienced. So information that I think is quite easily accessible to them as well. It's not so difficult to make those decisions when it's all based in your own experience. It doesn't require kind of prescience or super rationality or anything.
Yeah. There's this really nice Becker and Stigler paper. It's non gestibus non disputatum, which is Latin. I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong, but it's there's no accounting for taste. But they basically they do this. It's like a 1960s paper, and they're like, I love this quote from it where it's like, assumptions of differences in tastes are a convenient crutch to lean on when the analysis is bogged down. They give the appearance of considered judgment, yet they're basically ad hoc arguments that disguise analytical failures. And where they basically go is like say, hey, you can go and just say, all behavior is due to differences in taste, right? Men and women have different tastes, and maybe I'm sure they do at some level. But like when you start saying, oh, we're just going to explain everything by that, you're just opening up the world to saying whatever the heck you want. And you're just giving yourself way too many degrees of freedom. And like they said, it's ad hoc arguments that disguise analytical failures. And if you really are, if you want to go into, why, what's going on, why is there a gender wage gap, why do women, have, different occupational choices, some level that might be different preferences, different abilities or anything like that. But like that's basically, and you're basically just throwing your hands up in the air and saying, I can't explain this using the tools of economics, so I'm giving up.
Yeah, you've got. I mean, you've got what a statistician might call like an N equals K problem, right? Because you've got so many degrees of freedom. Whatever happens, you're just like, oh well, that's just different preferences, and you see it not just with preferences, you see it with culture as well, don't you? I mean, it's a slightly different argument, but you see it sort of people sort of, I don't know, someone might explain German efficiency, and you see this a lot in everyday conversation. People are like, oh well, those Germans, they're really industrious and efficient, and it's like there's actually not really an explanation because you're just telling me the outcome again in slightly different language.
Exactly. It's really funny. Tom Piketty has a really great piece in his book where, like, whenever they're talking about, like, how Sweden is egalitarian or whatever, he's like, you realize that in 1910, Sweden was like the most like income like unequal country in the world, right? Like you literally like they had, I think, like they had your vote was like how much you owned in land determined how many votes you had in the Senate. Like just completely ridiculous stuff, completely ridiculous genie. But now we're like, oh, like Sweden is where everybody is so believes in equality. But that's like a lot of that's because of institutions that were actually a reaction to the incredibly unequal society they had in like the 1890s, 1910s.
Yeah, it doesn't. I mean, the very basic problem with those types of explanations is that they're not very good at accounting for change over time, right? Within a given society or even within a given person.
Exactly, and you have to start ending as like why did Botswana grow so much or South Korea grow so much over this period of time? Like, did the culture just change or was it something else happening? It ends up being just you can't and of course the reason this is a popular argument to some extent is because it lets you justify existing social inequalities.
Yeah, exactly. It's just, yeah, it is just kind of. I mean, there's a refusal. I mean, it's interesting. So there's that Helen Lewis clip where they're talking about children and unpaid labor done by women, and she mentions capitalism, and Jordan Peterson doesn't really laugh very much, but he starts laughing when she mentions capitalism, and it just seems like, and then he says, well, it's not capitalism that are why women that is why women aren't paid for childcare. It's because of like delayed economic utility. We can't monetize a child in the first 18 years of their life, and they just seems to be a bit of a refusal to acknowledge anything other than kind of the basic biological facts of the world, and acknowledge any type of economic system. To even use the word capitalism, he wouldn't like to use that word. It's all just based on what men and women their preferences and their cultures and their skills and abilities.
I mean, and it's sort of funny. Like, I mean, I've been, one of the things I've been, spending a lot of time and we do a lot of work on in this canon is like working on, the child tax credit and that, there was a policy, law of the land in the United States for 6 months and then disappeared. And we're trying to get it back. But, they do have in United Kingdom, they do have in Canada, they do have in lots of other countries where you say, hey, like, if you're raising a kid, we're going to pay you something, right? Which is, not very much, $300 a month or something like that. But like, the idea that all these sorts of social institutions are, they're subject to control, right? Like, maybe there's some sort of, biological barrier, but like, there's plenty of differences, within or outside of capitalism, to the extent that capitalism is a well-defined term that you can sort of point to and say, okay, here's a way of doing this. If we wanted to, you know, it's so funny, and again, I don't know that argument that you mentioned very well, but like saying, oh, like, we don't pay people to raise children because it's deferred economic compensation. We do a lot of deferred economic compensation in the world, right? I mean, imagine going to, some companies like IPO and being like, oh, we're not going to pay you guys very much, right now, because that, you're going to make money in the future, Netflix or Amazon or whatever, like that don't make any profits for the first decade, like just being like, oh yeah, the CEO is not going to make any money for them.
Yeah, no, yeah, that's a really good point. Actually, is it? We deal with deferred economic compensation all the time, don't we? I mean, it's the basis of credit. Um, yeah. Okay. I wanted to talk to you a bit more about some of the studies. We've been kind of shooting Peterson down a bit, which is fun and not too difficult. But I think one of the important things to put out there, and this came up again in your exchange on Reddit with him, and maybe we can talk about this specifically, is there are a lot of studies he just ignores. Right, so it's one thing to get multivariate analysis wrong and get the gender pay gap wrong, but another issue is that there seems to be nothing on these really well designed studies. In my opinion, I was really impressed by. In fact, some of these studies were kind of one of the things that shifted my opinion on like how useful empirical economics can be, a while ago, and I think they're just really tightly controlled. So these like audit studies, where you send out CVs, and some of them are coded as some of them have a female name, some of them have a male name. In other variants, they might have a white sounding name or a black sounding name, and they're the same in all other respects. And then you see how do employers respond to them, right? So there's a lot of these been done, and you seem to know a lot about these audit studies. So I'd like to ask you a bit about them.
Absolutely. So yeah, I mean, like, so we went to this we talked a lot about the difficulty with like causal inference, and one of the language I really liked is that when you're talking about these sorts of questions about gender and stuff like that, you're asking what's called a fundamentally unidentifiable question, and so and you can say for short, you've been fucked, and so like. But the way you can, because you just can't go and say like, hey, I'm going to randomly assign people to being male or female, and then see how the labor market responds to that. But what you can do is make up people. And there's been, like you said, like this has been like a really great sort of thing to do. And like you said, like a lot, the most common one is like the resume audit, where you go out and you basically say, I'm going to send out 2,000 resumes to people, and change the names of them or anything like that. And like it's also something that like you can do fairly cheaply. You have to pay for postage and everything like that, or someone to send the emails more likely nowadays. But you can also ask a lot of questions about this, and especially like maybe a few decades ago, where like even just the idea that labor markets were imperfect was a little bit more controversial. Just being able to demonstrate like, oh, there's actually like some differences here was a huge deal. But you also have like ones that are a bit more intensive. So I think it's David Newmark who did one that was looking at like waiters and waitresses, where like literally he went out, he hired a bunch of actors, and he had those actors and actresses, of course, apply to jobs and go through and get these sort of things. And like again you can sort of ask there's so many of these papers right now, and but there's good lit reviews of them too. So Marion Bertrand and Esther Duflo. Esther Duflo, of course, won the Nobel 2 years ago for her work in these sorts of experiments, and as well as other experiments. But they have a great review of this, which is like goes through literally the hundreds of different studies that have been done on this, and like you can use it to study gender and race. You can use it to study caste in India. My favorite one of these is by Katie Milkman. And what she did is she literally sent out an email to one professor in every department in every school in the United States, and it was like a student who was thinking about joining that school, asking to if they could have like a quick meeting with them. And what she did is sometimes that meeting would be like in 2 weeks, and sometimes that meeting would be that afternoon, right? Like, and obviously, like you're less likely to get a positive response that afternoon, but um, like what was sort of interesting about it is that you saw differences in like racial disparities between it, right? So no one was likely to do it, but you actually saw a bigger race effect for those. Whereas like when you're sort of being more deliberate, doing stuff over time, you're less likely to see people act in that sort of racist way where they are doing. So like sort of actually figuring out the mechanisms. And a lot of folks have done some work on this, like trying to actually integrate this into how like people make jobs, right? So there's a whole bunch of companies that will like process resumes for you, where they take out stuff like the gender or anything like that. There's also folks who just look at ways of trying to de-bias this by changing some of the ways like it functions, right? So like there's a big I know you do behavioral economics, but like there's a thing called joint versus separate evaluation, and you're actually like
Mm.
more likely to if you're going and judging like four people at once, if you're saying, hey, here's four people who have applied to us, let's look at them all together, what their strengths, what their weaknesses, and then make a decision. That actually has a little bit less gender bias than if you're doing it sort of one at a time, where you're looking at everybody and going like rating them, yes, no, or on like a 10-point scale. So you can, very small changes to the institutions that you're making can actually make a big difference. But anyways, you're asking about like the audit studies, but yeah, this has been, a huge amount of work being done in this, and like, well, I'll add too is like, it's not necessarily like just straightforward like the labor market is worse for women, right? Like there's some studies that go and say, hey, we're going to find, we're going to think about a occupation that is, nominally female coded, right? So things like nurses, for example, and then do a study on that, and then they find that like, oh yeah, there's actually some, there's some discrimination then against men. So that the aggregate finding is much more like there's female coded and male coded professions, and you're sort of penalized for acting against that, going against that profession more so than there is a general female discrimination. That said, the female discrimination, the jobs with the female discrimination tend to be the jobs that also like make the most money on average. So it still kind of works out to something in aggregate.
Yeah, it is important that last point as well, because it's it is the case that for a lot of ethnic minorities, whether immigrant groups or African Americans, or maybe Muslims, what you'll find in these audit studies is basically they just have a blanket lower chance of getting pretty much any job they apply for, right? So
Yeah.
it's that type of discrimination. But with women, there are areas where there are occupations, there are industries, often caring industries, and perhaps customer facing industries, and perhaps
Exactly.
things like secretarial roles where they will be favored over men. So it's important to get that nuance, because if you just looked at a kind of an overall average, you might not quite see that full picture.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's all about just basically gender roles being enforced on people, right? Somehow
Exactly.
through discrimination, through early childhood expectations, and this is what makes gender discrimination kind of unique, I think, when you compare it to other types of discrimination.
Maybe I don't know about uniqueness. I do know that there's some interesting papers I've read. For example, in the United States, there's at least a bias that like Asians are good at math, right? That again, I'm not going to say anything about the accuracy of that, but like I think there's a cultural norm that that's the case. And my understanding is that like that bias does not exist in Canada. And there's been some studies that like that like where they try to do stuff like priming race in Canada, if you prime Asianness in the United States, that has affected like math scores if you're taking a math test, and it doesn't in Canada. So like I wouldn't go that far, but I do think that you're right that like gender, these gender biases are like really like interwoven and very like sort of consistent across a lot of domains.
Yeah, so I mean, one thing, I wanted to talk about is obviously, as Jordan Peterson's frantic googling revealed in his exchange review, these things can be contested. And one of the main examples you used in your exchange with him was this study, this orchestra study by Claudia Goldin. So this is a super interesting study, and it's like it acquired the status of kind of a kind of pop fact, right? You might see it on QI or I don't know what the US equivalent is, but one of these panel shows or something like that. If you blind the auditions, then women's hiring of women increases by 50%. It's actually quite a big number. But since then, I have actually. So the paper was written in 2000 by Goldin and someone else. I think Rouse. I can't remember. But that.
It's Cecilia Rouse, who's now Biden's chief economic advisor.
Oh, really? Okay, I didn't know that. Okay, that's interesting. But I have seen some critiques of it out there which seem quite convincing. So the basic issue is this: it has quite a small sample size, and the standard errors are quite big, perhaps too big for us to really be able to say anything concrete. So I don't know if you've engaged with those critiques, if they've changed your opinion of that specific study or not.
This is like I think this is a data collider or what data collada, is that what it is? I don't know how to pronounce it. But there's a nice blog post, and I think some people have written this stuff. I mean, the basic fact of the world is like almost any paper done before like I don't know 2006 in economics is kind of bad, right?
Yeah.
Anything that the economics had, and you can date this at different times, but like what we sometimes call the credibility revolution, where people said, hey, there's sort of two things that happened. Is like one, people got a little bit more sophisticated about the sort of the causal inference stuff I was mentioning, how you actually think about causes and stuff like that. The second thing that happened is that like the internet happened, and now it's a lot easier to get data. So like if you're reading a paper from 1998 or 2000, it's like this painstaking handcrafted data where like some RA had to like go out into the field and like call people and write down everything in an Excel spreadsheet, and then they got 30 observations and ran a regression on it, and they were the first ones to do it. And I like the way you talked about where it's like it's sort of like this. It's this incredibly like mediagenic paper, right? In that like you can go. It's very easy to explain how that paper works, right? Because you say, hey, there used to be these things with orchestras, and then they started blinding it, and then we saw that this stuff changed, and it looks like blinding it made the stuff better. Now, I think I think that the critiques that have been levied against this paper, like I think they're completely valid critiques. They're a little bit like it's sort of like the metagame if you're like playing Magic the Gathering or something like that. It's sort of like this paper is not good for today's meta. Where like everyone's like, everyone has lots of data and everyone has very sophisticated understanding of causal inference. But like in 2000, we're like literally there was not any papers that are like really went and said, hey, we're going to figure out how gender discrimination works. We're going to go and figure out what the effects are, because you just didn't have these like nice natural shocks until they came up with it. And so like that paper launched a lot of the work that happened afterwards, like the audit work that we discussed earlier. And I think you have to understand these sorts of papers in that sort of context. That like the paper itself is not a slam dunk gender discrimination is real and exists, because no paper is ever a slam dunk argument. But it is a paper that said, hey, this is more complicated than we might have thought it was. We should look into it. It's a hypothesis generating paper, not a hypothesis confirming paper. The example that I'll point to this is another paper that I'm sure people are aware of is like the Carden-Kruger minimum wage paper from 1995 or 1996, which is looking at Pennsylvania raised its wages in minimum wage, New Jersey didn't, or no, I think it's vice versa. And then saying, okay, like let's look, and Carden-Kruger, what they did is they like you went and called up every McDonald's in both states, or some RA did, and like went and figured out, okay, like we did this, and we see that wages didn't change. Actually, they found they found that the number of employees in the state that raised wages actually went up, which is the exact opposite of what people were predicting. And sort of, that paper has lots of flaws in it. Again, every paper has lots of flaws in it, but it was enough to sort of launch this sort of like examination of the minimum wage work. And now you have, a lot of literature, great papers by Aaron Dubé in particular, I'll mention, that have like, corrected any of those errors. But now you have this whole literature, and literature itself is much, much harder to critique. And problems that happens a lot in like online discussion of economics is like, the example papers that you're going to cite most of the time are going to be Card and Kruger's minimum wage paper, are going to be Rouse's and Golden's orchestra study, because they're really easy to explain to people. You don't have to say like, oh, here's how we got rid of this sort of like weird geographic bias that 14 people in the world know how to understand. So they really dominate a lot of the public conversation about it. But like they're really just papers that like launch these literatures, and the strength of the literature as a whole is much, much stronger than like any particular paper.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, it's something that you said to Peterson, right? So there's these. You referenced David Newmark earlier. There's his review of these types of audit studies, and there's the Dufflo paper as well. Dufflo and who else is it?
Marion Bertrand.
Bertrand and Dufflo. Yes, that's it. And Bertrand. Am I right in saying that Bertrand was the original audit study? Bertrand and that was the first one.
And Sendell Mullainathan, and I have to. Sendell is, of course, the founder of Ideas 42, so I have to give him a shout out.
Yeah. No, so that was a really pioneering study in this area, but it does seem to be fairly common. Not universal, but just they almost always seem to conclude that there's bias, these literature reviews.
Yeah, literature reviews do. And again, like I said earlier, like you can find individual papers that maybe don't find. Going back to the conversation I had with Jordan Peterson, like his sort of final thing that he mentioned was like, it's really funny. It was a lab study where they were went up to people and were like, we're going to be we're trying to figure out like how like hiring discrimination works, and like here's 2 resumes, and like and which one do you think is better? And people would, and there wasn't any bias there because people knew it was a study, like because they weren't actually making hiring decisions. And it's so funny that people always like people pointed that and like, aha, check out this study where like actually men did much worse. And yeah, men did much worse when you're like, get like when they know it's an experiment, right? Like like if you actually believe that, the way that we think a lot of these things work, the mechanisms is some sort of like unconscious biases where you're making fast decisions. You're saying, well, women. It's not that you're going processing and saying, oh, women are really bad at this stuff, but you're like, aha, this guy has all the capable. He seems like a capable leader, and he has a lot of gravitas to him. And then just not even thinking about, oh, is that because of his gender or because of something else? But like, if you go and tell people like, aha, we're doing a study on this, of course you're not going to find anything. It's just really funny when people like cite that paper or anything like that.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. It's funny because I supervise master's dissertations as well, and some people have done these types of studies, and I think there's what we've observed is that there's not actually any bias necessarily, but one of the issues is that you're using these online recruitment platforms, Prolific specifically. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but these people are pretty experienced in taking these surveys. They kind of do it not for a living, but certainly for a kind of side hustle. And they've been doing them for a while, and they probably know quite a bit about the literature. They know they're being watched, and they're probably familiar with the kind of CV approach. And what you get is they kind of cotton on to what's happening. They cotton on to the fact that they're being assessed for their race bias, their sex bias, or whatever. And therefore exactly what you just said happens. I mean, it is also possible. So this is one other thing I wanted to ask you. We're in 2022 now. The first audit study was what was it, 2004?
Yeah.
And yeah, so almost 20 years, probably 20 years since it was actually carried out. And it's quite possible that discrimination actually has gone down over time. So I mean, do you think that discrimination has gone down over time in kind of Western countries?
I won't say like yeah, I'll say like let's assume that anything I say about this is going to be like limited to the United States. That's what I sort
Okay,
of know
that's
about.
fair. Yeah.
Like in my assumption is that like if stuff in the United States will at least probably translate fairly well to the Anglosphere, maybe Western Europe and stuff like that. But yeah, I would say Claudia Golden, who again wrote the original orchestra paper, she has a like the way she talks about this is like yeah like it used to be really easy to find this. Like it used to be you could go and like read a firm's like internal hiring report and like and they'd have like in bold letters like do not hire any women, and then they'd say something like do not hire pregnant women, and you could see it really obviously in any of the wage statistics. And nowadays, like it's not that it's gone away completely, but now you have to be a little bit, have to be a little bit more careful and everything that, and the effects have gotten smaller. And it's always hard to say like, the causal effects are hard to say because like, no, like you said, no one's been we only have like the 20 years of data for like those sorts of audit studies. But you can definitely see it in the observational data that the wage gap has been decreasing over time. Where is it going to go in the end? Who knows? There's it might be that it gets to something approaching zero. It might be that sort of levels off where it is right now. But I do think that it is something where like, okay, it has changed over time, mostly for, sort of social reasons, right? Like I think the norms about, women working have changed a lot. And, I like how in your video, you made the Mad Men references and you think about that. Okay, that was, 60 years ago and things have changed a lot. Golden's most recent book basically like goes through like every generation of women's, from the beginning of the 20th century onwards and says, okay, like here's what the labor market was for these types of women. And, whether, including stuff like, after World War II, like, really a deliberate government policy was like, how do we push people, how do we push women out of the labor market?
Yeah, sorry, I was just managing chat a little bit. There's
But,
some people who are being annoying, and there's also a lot of bots. I don't know why I get so many sex bots. I'm not sure how
oh
common it is for other
yeah.
for other streamers. So yeah, sorry. So you just mentioned Gold in there, right? So we were talking about her orchestra study, but she's like possibly the most famous economist in
Yeah.
terms of research on the gender pay gap. And this is something that I didn't get a chance to touch on in my video, but she's basically kind of argued that the final part of discrimination, ending discrimination, will be about hours worked
Yeah.
and care responsibilities and how those two interact.
Mhm.
So could you maybe tell people a little bit about that?
Yeah. So she has this great paper about that's sort of like the case study for her some of her other work, but like about pharmacies, right? And it's the pharmacy is like the most egalitarian profession. So if you look at pharmacies, like so pharmacies, places you go to get like drug prescriptions filled. If you think about pharmacies, 50 years ago, pharmacies were almost always owner operator, right? So like you owned a pharmacy. If you think about like the example I would is like there's like a pharmacist in It's a Wonderful Life, right? He's like the one who tries to commit suicide and George Bailey stops him. But like
Mm.
he owns the pharmaceutical store. He's there and he's running it. He's a businessman. And that's what pharmacies were for 30 40 I don't know, actually longer than that, but like until maybe 1980s or something like that. But it was running a business, right, which meant you go there, you had to be an expert in drugs or interactions, but you're also an accountant, you're also a salesman, you're also a hiring manager, and all those sorts of things that happen. Now, what sort of happened to the pharmaceutical area is now, I don't go to my local pharmacist. I go to CVS. I go to Walgreens. It's become this sort of profession that it is no longer like there's one person who's running it all the time. They need to be in, and the amount of money they make is going to have this like almost exponential relationship to how much hours they put in. Now, if you work at a pharmacy, you're a wage employee. You go and you say, and you're also someone who can be substituted, right? So if you say, hey, I'm taking the weekend off, they find someone from the other CVS or the other Walmart or other Walgreens that can fill in for you, and you make that sort of wage. Now, a lot of jobs like lawyers right now are a job that is back at that sort of exponential thing. Like the more that there's sort of increasing returns, the more effort you put into it, the more hours you spend on it, the more likely you are to get promoted, the more you're making and everything like that. And what Golden sort of says is like, okay, right now, and again, like this is holding like the social norms around care work constant, right? Maybe that's not the correct way to think about it, but let's just hold it for constant in our head. Right now, women are traditionally expected to provide the bulk of the childcare. Yeah, me and my wife sometimes joke because like I feel like I do like a solid like 45%, and like that makes me like one like I'm like, oh, like it's so great because like every other guy I know like does 25%, and so I look like I'm doing great. I'm still doing slightly less than my fair share most of the time. But like right now those sorts of burdens really fall on women, and you have to like someone in the family, either either one of the parents, or if you're lucky enough to have like grandparents, has to be the who's going to do pickup during short hours during the summer, who's going to be taking the day off when the kids have a half day, who's going to bring them to doctor's appointment. There's all these sorts of things that you have to do as a caregiver, and that society has been designed for a long time under the assumption that there's going to be one, the woman is the caregiver, and there's going to be one person who's working a 9 to 5 office job and one person who's going to be working, a more part-time or a more flexible job. And what Golden has sort of said is like, okay, what we need, if we want to see the gender wage gap entirely eliminated. So again, we sort of see progress being made on the discrimination side, but if we want to see it really eliminated entirely, we're going to need to see jobs become much more flexible, which means that, like, again, I'm lucky enough, I'm a remote think tank worker. I can take 2 hours out of my day to do a stream with you, but also, like, if, like, there's things I have to do that I have to be sort of present for and doing work with. But a lot of my work is like I am writing, I am thinking, I am reading, which I can be doing at 4 a.m. and I can be doing, in a regular 9 to 5. And so, I have that sort of flexibility. As jobs become more flexible like that, and some jobs will, some jobs won't, you expect to see the gender wage gap go down. So like, the Secretary of Defense is never going to like be someone who's also a full-time caregiver. But like you could see a world where like eventually lawyers become that. Eventually, more jobs do it. And again, like pharmacies are really interesting in that you can sort of see that evolution over time.
Yeah, I mean, she's an interesting figure. So it's basically you can't, to be a caregiver, you basically have to be on call, right? And for some of these jobs, like doctor, lawyer, you also have to be on call. Available at any time, potentially for anything, and you can't basically be on call for two things at once. So it's like and one of the things you said was about this exponential relationship. So it's like it's not like working 40 hours instead of 30 hours, or even 50 hours instead of 40 hours, but it's like just that very extra, that end bit where these kind of high-powered professions require, I don't know, something late at night, some attention late at night for you to turn something around. That is really, really not amenable to primary caregivers, which is kind of similar to a point Jordan Peterson makes. Except, again, and this comes back to what we were saying earlier, he doesn't seem to think that we could ever change society or gendered expectations or welfare states or anything like that to try and make this more egalitarian. So he doesn't seem to think that's possible, when of course it is, right?
Yeah, and he says that like a lot, and not just in the gender context, right? Like I know there's something that I'm trying to remember, but like there's something where he go like one of the speeches he gives, or the his lectures, like he talks about like income distribution. He's like, aha, it's I think I think is it Person or something like that. But he
Mm.
goes and shows that like income distributions are have a don't differ that much across different things, and says, aha, like you can't change this. This is like a fact of society. But of course, like the genie in Sweden is different than the genie in the United States. Is different than the genie in Sudan. Like there are differences about it that are mediated through labor market institutions, macroeconomic institutions, all those sorts of things. And like you don't necessarily like I'm not going to go like full like sort of like blank slate like sort of thing, but like there are you can't like biology and gender and everything like that interact with like social stuff in labor market institutions and have results out of that. And it just isn't the case that like these things are just completely like not amenable to being changed by policy, right? He like there's a sort of defeatist way he talks about this things like, aha, like every time if you try to reduce income inequality, that's not going to work because you're just going to end up in the same distribution again. But of course, that's not the case, and we can see that when there actually are changes in these institutions, we do see changes in that. Going back to like talk about randomized trials, like when we see we have randomized trials where people go and get a basic income or whatever, and like it makes their lives better off. They have more money afterwards. And it's sort of funny. There's always a joke whenever a new study comes out where it's like, oh yeah, like everyone knew that they'd have more money, but people go out there and they claim that they won't. And so it's always useful to have more ability to refute that.
Yeah, I'd actually, you know what? I'd forgotten about that thing he said recently about income inequality, because I think we actually had an exchange afterwards, because we sort of both disagreed with it, but he was saying something along the lines of, if you can model the income distribution using, you can do it using models of gas particles or something along those lines, right? And
Yeah.
yeah, and therefore the income distribution is as natural as gas particles. And I thought, well, I mean, that's such a clear example of what a philosopher would call affirming the consequent, right? You can't go backwards from the predictions back to the model and say the model's definitely true. The model's there for you to do science and be able to generate some predictions, but you can't just like assume that because the income distribution kind of fits that produced by a model of gases, that people are somehow natural as gas particles and it can't be changed. So it's just a fairly basic scientific fallacy, right?
It's sort of funny too because like there's this like sort of when you say about like gas particles and like some fancy distribution like that sounds very sophisticated. But like if you said that about like the normal distribution and you're like, oh, did you know that like height is normally distributed? Like so clearly we can't change height. Like of course we can. Like people in America are taller than people in India because of better nutrition. And like that's like you can't go from this is this has a statistical representation to that this doesn't this is can't be changed. That he does make that jump, and it's quite odd. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And that seems to permeate all of his thought. I think it is something that is very clear in what he says about gender as well.
Yeah, it is really funny because like I mean one of my rants I had again at the height of the sort of intellectual dark web moment was like all they have in common is not understanding statistics, right? And having sort of having statistics as this like weird mystical force as opposed to like this sort of basic math that you can plug and chug into.
And it's used in such a way. I think the way he throws out all of these terms, I mean, not many people say multivariate analysis on a Channel 4 interview, and to be honest, I think I would try my best to avoid saying something like that.
Exactly.
Because most people just don't know what it means, and you're kind of blinding people with jargon and with science, and that's itself a way of trying to avoid critical questions. If you just explained yourself in plain language, then people would probably be able to engage with it. People who aren't trained in statistics.
Yeah. No, it was really like again at the time like there were all these people who would like do like little memes of like Jordan Peterson with like laser eyes saying, "What about the multivariate analysis?" And it was just really funny to be like, "Oh no, he's gotten this completely wrong," but completely wrong in this like subtle way that takes a bit of explaining to do. Whereas like, oh, the multivariate analysis, like it sounds very sophisticated, right? It's sort of cargo cult, statistics, right? Where you go and you say a lot of statistics words, you sound really fancy, and it's really easy for people to sort of like replicate it. And again, that's why like Ben Shapiro says this stuff a lot, but like it actually is really sort of meaningless, or more straightforwardly, just wrong.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's just like that. Yeah, the abuse. I mean, yeah, it's one thing to get statistics wrong. It is another to kind of be insistent that you're the one that's getting them right, and obfuscate. I think in this way, when you're actually not getting them right.
Yeah. Yeah, and Peterson again, like I sort of said in the initial conversation, like he's sort of, like I think, he's very sophisticated about the type of statistics that he did in his work as a psychologist, which is
Mm.
looking at what are the predictors of different sort of dispositions, and that's all well and good, but that's a very different sort of thing than the kind of causal work that we're you need to be thinking about. What do you think about like, oh, why do women end up in what jobs?
Yeah, I mean that seems like a good point to talk a little bit about the gender equality paradox when we're talking about causality, because I was pretty shocked by this because Peterson's always going on about how there's a in more gender equal countries there are fewer women in STEM, and he's really really confident, maybe even more so than he is about the gender pay gap, in what he's saying about it. And he's like, if you maximize if you minimize the social differences, you maximize the biological differences. And I was looking into it, and the main study, and it's got 600 citations. It's in Science, right? And it's just like a cross country correlation of 50 countries, and I was thinking, my God, like this is so far from causal way. It's about the worst thing. I mean,
Oh,
short of outright wrong data, it's about the worst thing I can imagine for proving causality, cross country correlations.
oh yeah. I mean, like it's so funny because like again, like in econ, this stuff's like almost second nature to some extent. Like, oh, you would never do that. You would never do that. Like just be like, I want to throw Tunisia and Sweden and the United States in a regression and see what comes out.
Yeah.
Um, like, but like, yeah, and I don't know. Like, there's the I think the paper you mentioned is it's the gender equality paradox in science, technology, engineering, mathematics by Stoughton Wilson, right? That's the one you're thinking of.
Yes. Yeah. Stowett
Yeah.
and Geary.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Because like I remember looking into this a few years ago, and what's like I thought was just really funny is like they didn't assemble this data, right? Like they found this data in some other paper and then ran the correlations and like I remember at one point like I went down like 5 papers deep to try and figure out like what the original like data was from for like their woman in STEM variable, right? And like I can't I don't. Someone should double check this because this has been a few years, but like it was sort of funny because like it's basically like this convenience sample. They went to they said, hey, we're doing a study on this, and we realize that no one has any cross country data on this sort of thing. So we're they went like they got some data from different like colleges and said like but not like every college, right? So like you might
Mm.
there's like 3 colleges in the United States that they got data from, and then one in Mexico. And like some of them, you look at this when you actually like, they're saying, aha, like, you know, 50% of women in this country have STEM degrees. And you're like, wait a second, this is, you surveyed 4 women. like, the noise on that's just enormous. And so like, it's one of those papers like I was talking about again with like the orchestra study. It's like a really like I don't want to critique this paper overall. Like I think it's a really interesting paper from that sort of hypothesis generating point of view. We're like,
Yeah.
oh, like
I agree with that. I completely agree with
like
that. It's
something is
fine.
going on here. Like let's look into this. Let's dig into this a little bit more. but instead the way it gets used in like the online discourse and by Peterson is like it's this like complete knockout argument where you're like, aha, like clearly women just want to be homemakers, and the more the more economic, like, the less we restrict them, like the more likely they are to be. And it ends up being just like really weird too, because like, like what, if you're looking at college, like, well, you look at the United States, like 40% of people go to college, slightly more women than men. And then you like go to a developing country and you say, aha, like half of, going to college to get a STEM degree means a very different thing in the United States than it does in a country where like almost no one goes to college, right? Like if where it's like almost like more, it's almost like where the United States was in the 19th century. It's like almost like a finishing school for the rich and prestigious, right? If you, it's like a very very different thing to go through. But yeah, I mean, I wrote a little bit about this again. I really like the part your video about this, but like, one of the things that I looked into said, okay, like what if you just go, like the obvious like omitted variable here to me is GDP, right? That GDP both has like more like more payoffs to non-STEM jobs, right? It's good to be a lawyer if you live in a rich society, more so than if you're in a poor society. But it also has like it does better on like those gender gap indexes. And like if you control for GDP, or this stuff goes away. And even if like the way I did it, if I recall, like I basically like just said, okay, like let's take these, let's rerun this analysis, but like just run it by continent, right? So within continent, you don't see this relationship, right? If you say, okay, within South America, do you see this relationship? You don't. Within the Arab world, do you see this relationship? You don't. Within the English-speaking world, do you see this relationship? You don't. And if the mechanism is what he is saying it is, what a lot of other people are saying it is, you'd expect to see it consistently. You'd expect to see like, aha, if to the extent there are differences in gender equality between, Ireland and the United States and Australia, that should lead to differences in women in STEM, and it doesn't. And it doesn't, so it really suggests that something is going on there. And again, like GDP is a big, like poor countries and rich countries are very, very, very different, and you have to think about these things when you're looking at it.
Yeah, it's just like there are so many differences between countries, and there was a paper which I actually only became aware of, and I'll maybe link it in the description afterwards. But it just says basically stop doing cross country correlations, because there's you just get like a bunch of because their countries can be grouped together, right? You can have the Scandinavian or even the Nordic countries. You can have Western Europe, Eastern Europe. You know what I mean? The Arab countries, and you can group them all together, and then they're all going to be really correlated. Just because of quite a shared history and all of this type of stuff, and then you can chuck them all into some kind of correlation between a lot of different things, and you're probably going to find something that's like statistically significant, positive or negative, just because of that shared history. So you just can't really infer too much from it, because there is that huge omitted variable of, I mean, you're talking about like GDP. But you could more broadly sort of talk about like history and culture and things like that.
Exactly. Like in the way that this is definitely done in like comparative politics stuff is more case study, right? You go and say like, aha, there's Norway and Sweden, and then Sweden did X, and we're going to look at effects there. And even that's like always a little bit sketchy to say. Like, these things are just really, really hard, which is why I'm a microeconomist and not a macroeconomist. Like, but I think, yeah, I remember that paper that you it's hard being sort of like on the edges of like these sorts of things. You're like, you read this paper saying, hey, never ever do a cross country analysis. There's a paper I know that was basically saying like never add controls to things unless you have like a specific causal reason to do it. But like there are, people are pretty sophisticated about this, and like you have, the you if you're trying to do good econometrics, you're trying to do good statistical work, you have like very sharp constraints on what you can do. And there's a lot, and again, like I always feel bad because like I don't want to criticize this paper. I think this is a good paper, but the way it gets used in the discourse is not great. And it's sort of funny too because like even the paper itself like is I forget like the mechanisms that they propose are very different than the ones that like Peterson is claiming, right? I can't remember what it exactly was, but like they're yeah they like I'm looking I've got it in front of me. So it's like yeah it's life pressure goals and less gender equal countries promote girls and women's engagement STEM subjects. It's like yeah like people at lower GDPs are going to be like want
Mm.
they're at that point where like the diminishing marginal returns hasn't set in to some extent. So it's like you're going to really want to get like the degree that leads you to the best possible career, which might be STEM and might not.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And yeah, the I think um, oh, I've kind of lost what I was going to say. I don't even know what I was going to say then. I think one thing I wanted to ask you about was the global gender gap index that they use. So you just said it was about 10 minutes ago now, but you said about the STEM samples
Yeah,
being
yeah.
really, really unreliable because they were like convenient samples collected from a few universities in or one university in each country. And so the percentage of STEM participation that you see in this gender equality paradox may just be actually like itself wildly inaccurate. So the other side of the correlation is the global gender gap index, which is like a measure of gender equality. Now, I don't have an issue with compiling these indexes as such. I think that the world, is it the World Economic Forum or the World Bank?
Yeah,
But
yeah, yeah.
yeah. So that they compile it and they track it over time and they look at how there's progress on this index. I think that's absolutely fine as a self-contained exercise. But then when you get people kind of taking that and putting it into these regression models and making broad inferences from it, it seems to be quite it seems to be pretty suspect to me. So what do you think of the GGGI?
I lean a little bit. I'd say mostly in agreement with what you said. Like again, like I don't want to. Like my assumption with this is like the people who work at the WEF and like work on this like are going to be fairly sophisticated, do it in thinking about like all the obvious things that I would think about, and trying to do this. And like this type of work is hard to do, right? Like I don't know too much about this, but like I remember I was doing some research a while ago with like the World Value Survey, and like just going and doing like translations and stuff like that, incredibly hard. As I mentioned, like figuring out what is a STEM degree between different countries is really tricky. It gets like really weird on that. In terms of like your point about like I think you're right that like you know be careful about throwing data into regressions when you don't know how that data was made, and like how it sort of operationalizes. A lot of times, you catch people doing these sorts of things. There's a great example that comes up all the time in like the housing discourse where people will say like, aha, like, you know, household formation is really low right now, so we don't need more houses. And then people are like, you realize that housing formation is a product of how much housing is available. Like you can't use it to make that argument. You see that sort of thing all the time. Again, the global gender gap, I'm sure they're doing their best sort of job on that. But like when people use it, I'm sure there's going to be like weird sorts of things. That said, like I'm sort of comfortable with like what you said about like the throw together an index and try to make sense of the world. It's one of those things where like I think that there's a good sophisticated like math argument that you shouldn't do this and like nothing's gonna like there's gonna be all these sort of technical problems with it. But I think that like on a sort of like empirical sort of thing, it almost it sort of works a lot of the time, right? And it can't it's at least useful for these sorts of exercises. Again, like the original paper, being like, aha, like how do these things correlate? But like the key is to not stop there, but to keep digging after.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think Sarah Richardson, and they're the people who kind of prompted the corrigendum in that in the original paper, and they've been big critics of the interpretation of the gender equality paradox. But I think one of the things they said is that the GGGI, it measures a whole bunch of things, including political empowerment, but actually there's not really too much in it that's geared towards measuring attitudes in science or anything like that. So it's like, well, maybe there's a reason it's not correlated with STEM participation, because actually there's nothing really about that directly in there.
Yeah. Yeah, it'd be really interesting to sort of like, do, and again, this is like a huge research project, so there's a reason no one's done it, but like to go and be like, hey, what is the differences like across different countries on these sorts of like gender biases? Like do you talked about this a little bit in the video, but like, okay, you go and asking all these sorts of questions about like, do women self-identify as being interested in math more, and then see how that sort of changes things. But like, yeah, trying to disentangle these sort of social norms versus like labor market outcomes versus like biological destiny. Like, it is. There's nothing you can do that isn't going to be like problematic from a statistics point of view. Like, it's just not. It's just like a research question that's just hard to get to, and makes really really unlikely that you're going to have a good answer. But it's worth doing. And again, like, I don't like that people use it as this like knockout punch sort of argument. But it is worth thinking about. And again, like like even just the fact that like you're like, hey, Sweden ends up with these sorts of things. It's sort of funny. Again, I work in Niskanen, which is like a center right think tank, and one of the things that we talk about is how do you know there's definitely a way that you could go and say like, hey, we should adopt a lot more Nordic model institutions, because we're for the conservative reasons, right? That if you want these things to be the case, that's the push you would make. And if to the extent like people like Bernie Sanders are always saying, hey, we should be more like Denmark, you could have Blake Masters, who's sort of running his Senate campaign for Arizona. Like, one of the things he's saying is like, oh, we should go back to having one earner families, and the way to do that might be to adopt a lot more Nordic model institutions.
Yeah, it is. It is interesting, that type of argument. You see it occasionally from some conservatives, but the idea that basically, I mean, and this is what happened in Scandinavia. So I mean, Peterson's interpretation of Scandinavia is essentially that they've pursued gender equality, and that's decreased female participation in STEM. And I think that's what comes from interpreting those indexes too literally, right? And just being like, gender equality is a dial and you just kind of turn it up and then the STEM participation goes down. It's much more multifaceted than that. What you've seen actually is an expansion of a welfare state which was really geared towards providing economic opportunities or support for women in their role as mothers, to the extent that men may not have had things like paternity leave, and women were just, maybe in the case of Denmark, I think it was, they weren't really allowed to own property and things like that, right? But they were supported in their role as caregivers, and so that's quite a complex, I think, historical situation. And it's why, I mean, you said that macroeconomics is hard. History is also hard, don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
But
Yep.
I think I sometimes prefer a historical approach to kind of just having so few data points and trying to do statistical inference. And this is what I tried to do in my video, right? I was like, okay, it's difficult to draw these inferences. And it's nice to look at the details of the policies and see that, no, actually, like, gender equality in terms of support for women, for mothers, has gone hand in hand with like gender discrimination. And I mean, one of the facts I said in the video, which is in that QJE paper which was released this year, is that sexual harassment in Sweden is second only to the United States. So it's kind of pretty ridiculous. I mean, those, again, cross-country comparisons can be difficult, so there may be questions to raise about the comparability of those measures, but like, it's still very common in Sweden, and it's quite glib just to be like, well, gender equality is highest in these countries. It's really
Yeah.
multifaceted.
And it's interesting. Like again, like history is really like again. I like citing Thomas Piketty on this stuff because like one the phrases he says over and over all the like this is a historical and a contingent like situation which may have gone other ways, and he says it like 18 times in 18 different wording. But like you basically like there's this weird way in which like Sweden, Finland, Norway, etc. They sort of built their welfare state like much earlier than other countries did, and so like had sort of before like third wave feminism came on board. And it's interesting like when you think about like some of the debates happening right now in America, like there's a debate. This is happening last year about like Build Back Better. It's like, okay, how should childcare work, right? Do we basically go ahead and provide like free childcare to everybody? Because and like in a way that will very specifically like motivate, like make it easier for people to go into the workforce because it's like, hey, you have free childcare, so you can go work 9 to 5. Or do we do something that more like a child allowance, where you just give people money for having kids, and you can do that as you will. You can use that, you can use that to pay for school. You can use that as just extra money for the kid, and like that. There's a huge sort of discussion about that, and like, and feminism has like a big role in that discussion. You have people like Matt Brunig, who's really big fan of the Nordic model, really big promoter of that, getting into arguments with a lot of like sort of feminist people, who are saying no, we want to really directly encourage women to enter the labor force and get out of the home. And like but all this stuff is more complicated, like you said. Yeah, and that's sort of interesting. Like I don't know if that's exactly what happened with like the Nordic countries, but like that makes sense to me right now. That like they basically built these like really early welfare states that didn't incorporate a lot of the sort of like later changes to how we think about women in the job market. And maybe if countries that have newer ones like might address that in very different ways. It sort of reminds me of like how a lot of like African countries have like much more sophisticated financial systems. You could, if you had like if you're in Kenya in like 2000, you could pay for everything with your phone, and you couldn't do that in the United States for like 5 years from now because our financial infrastructure is built so much earlier.
Oh, that's a really interesting analogy. That, yeah. So it's just like, historical path dependence, right? Like once you've
Exactly.
set things up in a certain era with certain certain culture, certain technologies, and certain biases, right? And then when it comes down to it, countries which are kind of playing catch up, inverted commas, in some ways, can implement actually much better technology, much better social systems. I mean, yeah, you do seem to be hinting at like how we can manage this issue in the modern day with some kind of modern welfare state that ensures childcare, but not necessarily, childcare that's just aimed at women, right? Something where we can support people. And I mean, it's worth mentioning, my semi troll, but also like serious historical example of the Soviet Union, right? Because they had, I was really interested. They had such extensive care support for women that they were basically able to just be scientists, right? And be kind of, we were talking about Goldin's work on like being on demand and things like that, working a lot of hours. If there's a really extensive support for care, then actually that might be possible. And I stress again, I'm not saying bring back the Soviet Union, except as a troll.
Right. It's one of the trolls that you also, when you start talking yourself into it.
Yeah, exactly. So Matt, so there was another thing which I haven't touched on actually, and I didn't until I reread your exchange with Peterson. I forgot he said this at all. But before we go to like Q&A, there was one thing Peterson has says, which was about the decline of wages and the entry of women into the labour force. Right. So
Yeah.
this was really interesting what he said. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on it and what you said to him about that.
Yeah, so let me start by saying like there's one level which like what Peterson is saying there is sort of wrong. So like what he basically said, let me pull up my thing, but he's like, hey, you doubled the labor force, and so therefore you have the wages. And that's sort of it's sort of really funny to say that, because of course that's wrong, right? That he what he was doing in saying that is sort of implicitly holding GDP constant. But like that's not how GDP works. Like GDP, like labor is an input into GDP, and the more labor you have, the more GDP you have, right? You're building more stuff, right? And you can sort of think about it. Now, does that mean that doesn't mean necessarily that you won't see women entering the labor force possibly have. Let me say something else before I go back to that. I think a lot of people have start from this from like the completely wrong intuition where you think of like women not being in the labor force and then being in the labor force. And I think a much better way to think about this is thinking about them as if they move from one sector to another, right? So in the same way that like, people move from agriculture to manufacturing or manufacturing services, you can think of women as being engaged in domestic production versus household versus firm production. And when you think about that, you basically say, okay, what happened was, you know, like you basically had increase, changing in the social norms that allowed women to go into the workplace. Also had changes in technology and productivity that meant two things. It meant one, that you could sort of automate a lot of stuff that was happening domestically, right? When you have a microwave, when you have a dishwasher, when you have a clothes washer, you're not spending a lot of time doing stuff by hand, and you can sort of not that it's not, it would be nice to have your house impeccably clean all the time, but like you don't need to be there all the time. And then what also happened is that we the economy became more like capital intensive. We started paying people more to do stuff just in general, and so because of that, women entered the labor market. And so like again, like this goes back to the stuff we were talking about at the very beginning, like the sort of like yeah, you have to think about women as agents. You have to think about women as people who respond to incentives. Again, like it's this like very basic econ insight, but it's actually really important sometimes. Now, at the same time, like if we did a general prohibition and said women are not allowed to enter the workplace, that would probably drive men's wages up like a little bit, like because you're moving out of that sort of diminishing returns area to like sort of thing. But the United States as a whole would be less wealthy, and households as a whole would be less wealthy. That and that's sort of really important. There's also like there's this way that like a lot of people use a lot of statistics here wrong. So like one thing you'll see a lot of the time is like people who look at statistics like labor force participation, right, and say, aha, like male labor force participation is declining, right, and you can see it declining from so 1980s. But what people miss a lot of times is that a lot of that's demographic. A lot of that is because of the changing age pattern of the workforce. That basically a lot more people are 65 plus and aren't retiring or anything like that. I am going to once again share my screen, and this time I'm going to pull up some stuff on Fred. This is showing the employment rates by gender, and it's within the age between 25 to 54. And what we call that is that's the prime age.
One second, Matt.
Okay.
Sorry,
You've got to approve it, I guess. Yeah.
I've got to actually allow it in. So 1 second. Where's this? Okay, we're on Fred. We're on Fred. So we've done Stata and now we're doing Fred.
We're hitting all the best ones here.
Yeah.
So if you look at male, so there's you look at the male one, right? So this is looking at the employment rate. So we're holding age to the people who almost certainly should be working, right? 25 to 54 means that you've mostly got people out of college and you've mostly got people who aren't retired, right? And that's the reason you're trying to do this. You're trying to like sort of isolate the people so you cannot be looking at it. Now, it's slightly lower right now, but if you look at it, like when women were entering the workforce from 1975 or whatever to 2000, you can see that increase. you don't really see like men's participation going down, right? That it's 90% in 1975, it's 89% in 2000. There's there's obviously fluctuations around recessions. You can maybe squint and tell yourself that there's like an overall decline, but it's really hard to say that. There has been since 2000 an overall decline, but men and women have kind of been parallel to that. And I don't want to go into macroeconomics too much in this. This is not what we're here for. But like I think that's a lot of that is just us not running a hot economy for a long time until 2019 really. But like we really we had the 2001 recession, 2008 recession, the COVID recession, and we just haven't had that many sort of long sustained growth periods like we had in the 90s, where you can actually like kind of push the labor the employment rate up towards the 88, 89s for men. But again, like you look at this and you look at women and men, it's basically like once women hit around 73, 75, they've been sort of paralleling men since then. And so people look at they look at other statistics, they look at labor force participation, and that gives them the wrong idea because they're mostly picking up the fact that a lot of men retired, since 1990 as a percentage of the population.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So it's been like a women entered the workforce, and then their trends have been largely similar to men, including a kind of generalized decline in labor force participation over the 2000s, right? Because that was, like you said, not running the economy hot. But there doesn't seem to be any kind of displacement, right? That's not what we're seeing.
Yeah, and again, like I'm sure it happens at some margins. Again,
In specific industries, you could imagine, maybe, I guess.
and like the better case we have this is of course the work on immigration. So we keep bringing up David Card because David Card comes up all the time. But when you see immigrants like enter the workforce or come to America in sort of random-ish ways like the Mariel boat lift, you don't really see that affect wages that much, partly because they end up buying more stuff. Women's a slightly different situation because they're obviously already in America buying stuff, but they buy more with their income. And so again, did this have some minor effect on men's wages? Probably. But if you're trying to go and push to this as women, explaining the overall effect thing versus the decline in unions, worse macroeconomic stabilization, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, I think you're missing the forest for the trees.
It's doing a lot of work, isn't it? Really, and for him, and because he's trying to explain stagnant real household income through this entirely, right? And that is most certainly a reach, because it's pretty simple. If you've got more people, they're producing more stuff, and it expands the economy. Another way of saying it is, they affect demand as well as supply. There's lots of different ways of saying it, but it's a really common fallacy, I think, that a lot of people hold. And you mentioned immigrants, right? And I think you get it with overpopulation as well. I think a lot of people have this kind of idea that there's kind of a fixed amount, and you can't add more people in any way, whether they're women or immigrants or people being born, because that's going to reduce what's available for everyone else. But it's easy to forget that the new people are good in the sense that they are also productive and innovative and all the rest of it. We benefit in numerous ways from the expansion of the population.
Exactly. And again, women immigrants are a slightly different situation, but I think that same intuition of they went out, they got jobs, they doubled their household income, they spent some money, and again, that's going to the extent you're worried about it, that's going to mitigate, the bulk of it, and is it is there some reasonable regression you could be running or a reasonable causal inference attempt where it says, hey, maybe it went down, 2%. Sure, but again, like you could say, hey, we're going to impoverish every household to like maybe make men's wages a little bit higher. I don't think anyone thinks that would take that policy serious.
Yeah, absolutely. So Matt, so I reckon it's time for some Q&A. Have we got you for maybe 15 more minutes or something like that?
Fine,
Because we started a
we
bit
got
late.
started a little bit late, so I'm
Yeah.
happy to go a little bit longer too.
That's great, thank you. So yeah, if anyone has some questions for Matt, um, I would say on the subject of gender discrimination, broadly speaking, just to narrow it a little bit. I know there's some that have come up a little bit across as things have gone on. Chat's been quite difficult to keep up with. There's actually quite a lot of people in it.
Yeah,
No, so just another economist asked this. I found it. So this is a very specific question. I wonder if he knows that you know
this is
about
like
this.
the Nun 2011 one. I don't, I'm not familiar with the paper.
Oh, you're
That's
not
fine.
familiar with it. You're not familiar with that paper. Okay. So apologies to just another economist. But yeah, that's an
I'm
extremely
happy. I'm
specific
happy to.
question.
I think I vaguely remember reading it, like, or hearing about it, but like not nothing I'd be comfortable like commenting on extemporaneously.
Yeah, that's completely fair. Um, so okay, so Occam's Spoon, good name, says based on your experience, what is the most challenging element of educating people about gender discrimination?
Oh gosh, I don't know. That's a great question. Like, so one thing that's kind of fun about like arguing with people on Reddit and Twitter a lot is you get to like practice different things, right? And I sort of like eventually got to the point where like the gender wage thing, like I knew exactly what points that they were going to make and everything like that, and sort of, and you can kind of get to this like end state, which is like they say something like, hey, like I don't think that you know women know that discrimination exists and stuff like that, which I always feel like is a very very silly point. It's really weird that that comes up. But I would say like where it. I think a lot of the thing is that like people have these intuitions that are just wrong, and it's really hard when have it. Like people have to be willing to engage with you on this and to chat with you about this and to like go and like think about this for a little bit with you and being with that. And like as is the case with a lot of these sorts of like hotly contested topics, it's really hard to do that. And again, like I'm sure that's that's true on the other side, and it's hard to say. But like the poverty of the public discourse about this, where it is like this weird people saying, aha, like the gender wage gap is 70%, and that means like, a woman working the same job makes 30% less. Like that, as I think Unlearning said in his video, like that oversells it a lot, right? And being like, okay, no, like the papers are saying something that seems like that, but that's not what they're saying. They're saying like, okay, if you throw all these things together, and this is what like the sort of average difference is, it gets a little bit more interesting. But yeah, I think it is just like people mostly don't want to know things. People want to have like culture war arguments, not econometric arguments. And I think half of what I try to do is force them to have an econometric argument. And like one of my favorite quotes is from Jimmy Savage. He's a U Chicago economist in mid 20th century, but he's like, the role of statistics isn't to find out truth. The role of statistics is to bring people together. That like you can go and say these things and you can have a conversation with somebody like, well, I think that biological stuff does play a role, and there really is a difference in preferences or abilities or whatever. And you can say like, okay, that's fine. Like you can believe that, but all I want you to do is acknowledge that your regression does not demonstrate that. And that you're just, that's just your pre-existing opinion and not something that's coming out of the research.
Yeah, thank you. So another question we've got from Tyrannosaurus is, hi Matt, what is the current research frontier in the gender
Oh,
discrimination space?
I
It's a good
I
question.
I I deliberately stay about 10 years behind the research frontier. The research frontier, I'm guessing, is going to involve a lot of like double machine learning. I think one of the, what was the name of the, you might know. the woman who did that study on that awful AJMR where they did like a like natural language study on like how people refer to women economists versus men economists. Do you remember that?
No, I don't. Oh wait.
I
How
know
they refer?
Justin Wolfers wrote about it.
Yeah,
When
yeah.
I went to
The seminar
the
one. Do you
yeah.
mean? Yeah. So
But
they
like
looked at the language used when there were female speakers versus male speakers and the frequency of questions, interruptions.
yeah. I'm linking to the Wolfers study. So it's Alice Wu, who's she was an undergrad at the time, working with again David Carr, but she's now at she's was get started her PhD at Harvard. But like she did a thing which is like scraping a tons of data from like economics forums and then
Mm,
figure out like what the words that people use and stuff like that. But like you know economics is more and more becoming very like sophisticated or like more data sciencey in a lot of different ways. And so like before you used to be able to do like novel work by being like, I'm going to send out some resumes, I'm going to change the names about this, and now you have to you know a bunch of natural language processing and stuff like that. So that's sort of where it gets to. So I think that's the most recent people that I'm most familiar with.
yeah, yeah, definitely that type of machine learning and reading like language and text. I've seen a lot of that. I also saw an interesting paper recently, which was an attempt to like econometrically, and I haven't read it in full for the record, econometrically quantify what you could call like institutional discrimination. So there's like discrimination kind of at the point of contact, right? Where you
Mm.
say I'm not going to hire this woman because the man's really I can't remember what you said, really articulate and he's a great leader or whatever. There's that kind of discrimination, but then there's everything that happens before that, right? That puts people into the positions that they're in. And there was this paper that was trying to basically look at that aspect of things, the structural or institutional aspect of discrimination, as well as kind of the at the point of interaction discrimination, which I guess is more what the audit studies were geared towards.
Yeah,
Mm.
yeah. I mean, it's interesting because, like, I think the public view of economics and the private view is very different sometimes. But like, a lot of economists is like, basically you just go and talk to different firms and try to get them their data. Like I know Google's hiring lab, like they did a ton of research on this, and Google being really big at scale, they can do stuff like this, but they also do lots of like A/B testing and stuff like that. So like they did tons of work on trying to do like little experiments and saying like, hey, but and I mentioned this earlier, but like there's lots of things you can do that are sort of like weird, like how do you structure these things? How do you structure these sorts of micro interactions in ways that can debias things? And again, like that the one I mentioned earlier, which was the separate versus joint evaluation, whether you're evaluating candidates all at the same time or like one after another. Like that's something that's just like a very weird thing that like and like you don't think of as like playing a big role in like gender bias, but because it's activating different cognitive processes, it ends up having a role there.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I was just dealing with chat. Yeah, so that paper was systemic discrimination theory and measurement by Buran et al. That one I was just talking about. So Little Keegs asks, what does what does a welfare state that helps combat gender inequalities in care responsibilities look like? So we kind of touched on this, but it might be good to talk about it a little bit more.
Yeah. I mean, again, I'm going to put on my basic econ hat and be like, hey, you incentivize different things, right? So to start with, like let's think about how its incentive is right now. In America, you are taxed for labor income, and you're not taxed for So the classic like GDP thing where it's like, oh, if a man marries his secretary and nothing else changes, he keeps on acting as his secretary, but like you know he's now paying her in kind, but not it's no longer a market transaction. GDP goes down. And what the other thing that happens there is taxes go down, right? Is that the secretary used to be paying taxes on that labor, and now she isn't. And so the
Mm.
United States system, as it is right now, slightly incentivizes people to leave the workforce and have one person work a bit more. There's all sorts of things that people try to do this about. My colleague Rob Orr has a couple of blog posts I can find and link to, but on on the marriage penalty taxes and stuff like that. But I think there is this sort of very basic question of how are we incentivizing it right now. Right now, policy leans, I think, a little bit more towards pushing people towards labor market income. You could imagine policy leaning a little bit more away from labor market income. And you could imagine policy leaning a little bit more the other way on that sort of tax incentive things. The other thing is just thinking about those things that I talked about with respect to Claudia Golden's research is that sort of what are the microstructures within individual workplaces that really matters. And so again, pharmaceuticals saw this as a result of corporate consolidation, technical changes, being able because you can now look up on Google interactions between different drugs instead of having to memorize it. But you can also imagine things that are coming out of policy related things here. So I know right now, one thing that's happening right now is we've had, for the past year and a half, this really, really tight labor market, which has meant that workers have a lot more power bargaining with their employers. And one of the ways that they've been doing with this is saying, hey, I'd like to work remotely. And we start working remotely during COVID, and I'd like to keep it this way. And a lot of managers saying, yeah, I'd really rather you back in the office. And it's kind of funny because we can't actually find anything negative in the productivity statistics, but managers they just like to know where you are and what you're doing and be able to follow you around.
Mm.
But working remotely is so much better from this sort of caregiving perspective. And it's really funny. So I have a 6-year-old daughter, and so the COVID times has been her transitioning from daycare where they will keep you from five from they know that you're working, they keep the kids there from 8:30 to 5:30 to proper school where they get out a bit earlier and the expectation is that you will do parent teacher conferences. And I do not understand how this could possibly have worked for me pre-COVID because I'm a half mile away from the home. I bike from the school. I bike there. And I also have a flexible enough job that I can be hey, I'm going to be gone for 2 hours because I'm doing a dentist appointment, and that's really, really easy for me to do. But if I had an office job where I had to be present, I couldn't do that sort of thing. And of course, right now, a lot of people who are not in this sort of privileged knowledge work, office work, don't have that right now. So I think labor power itself, I think, gives people more ability to push for working conditions that work well for them, which for parents especially is going to involve a lot of care work.
Yeah, a tight labour market is the solution to most problems. I
Yeah.
find that just yeah. Um, is that a bit of an overstatement?
No. It's really funny. I was Aaron Dubé, who's one of the big minimum wage people. He was saying that he's the best way to cure monopoly is a tight labor market. I'm oh, I had him in my head as the minimum wage guy, but that's not he's on board with team full employment.
Yeah, absolutely. Team full employment. So Naomi asks, so this is kind of related to what you've just said, actually, so it's a good follow-up question. Do you think the normalization of remote work post-pandemic will have an effect on gender discrimination in labour?
That's a great question. And I don't have a pre-existing answer to that, so I'm gonna just vibe for a bit. But I would hope so, right? Again, the more we keep this stuff stable in work mode, the easier it is to do, right? And it's sort of funny, you think about the what I was talking about earlier in terms of how women make decisions about their occupation. like you can have, two people who are, basically making the same amount. One's maybe like 98% of the other. Like that person making 98% is going to be the one that leaves the labor market to help with childcare, right? Like very consistently, right? Because it's a very small effect, but it compounds because of these larger things. So I think there is this like real potential for that stuff to happen. Again, I'm an economist, behavioral economist. Like I'm not like what I will say about changing social norms is that it seems to be really difficult and it seems to be really hard to guess which way it's going to go.
Yeah.
And so I'm not going to make any sort of like big predictions, but it does feel like workers do want remote work. Workers are currently winning the fight against their employers against remote work. If we enter a recession next year, maybe that all goes away. But like I do think it is the case. Like the longer you keep a tight labor market, the more you're likely to see these sorts of breakouts.
I mean, there is an interesting point to make there, because I did just say that a tight labour market solves all your problems, but I do think that like sometimes economic change without like cultural and social change doesn't necessarily completely solve the problem. So one of the really well known examples is like when you offer academic males paternity leave, they end up actually not caring for the child and just writing a book.
Yes, yes,
Yeah,
yes,
and
yeah.
so you can see something analogous with remote working. You wonder, are they both going to be remote working and in theory caring for the child equally, or somewhat equally? But then actually, it's just like the man's just kind of doing his own thing. I think you do need some change to change the expectations as well, right?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly, exactly. Like the labor market institutions and economic institutions, like and the social ones are going to co-evolve. And like, I think labor market institutions can maybe create a space for these sorts of shifts in social norms, but they can't, they don't push for them necessarily.
So one final question, which is a really nice one, is: does Matt have any tips for budding economists?
Oh my gosh. So what I'll say, and I talk about this sometimes on Twitter and stuff like that, so I'm happy to talk about this about. I'm sort of like, a person who thought he was going to get an econ PhD, and I never got around to it. And I also did apply and didn't get in when I first got out of college. Econ PhDs are really, really, really hard to get into. And like, unlike a lot of other PhDs, like, majoring in economics is not actually a good route to it. And so people don't, it really should be. It sort of has a broken system right now. And so, what if you want to get an econ PhD, you basically want to take like 4 classes in econ and then math all the time, because your first couple classes are going to be like these heavy proof based things. So that's the sort of first thing I'll say about being a budding economist. The other thing I'll say is like you can do a lot of cool stuff without a PhD in economics. Like maybe this is me like just talking up, but I'm like I kind of feel like I do the same sort of thing that I would have had in the counterfactual where I got a PhD. Um, you know, I, you know, I did really exciting research that I wanted to do at IDS too. I do really exciting research that I want to do in its canon. But I had to like be lucky to get those jobs to some extent, right? I couldn't, I had to be timing, getting really interested in behavioral economics just when Ideas 42 started, getting really excited about talking about unemployment insurance just when this canon said, hey, we're going to expand to doing employment work. And so I've been lucky rather than good in a lot of ways. But like I think there is a really open sort of idea where you're like going and learning stuff, and like it's fascinating to me. Like I'm always finding these sorts of questions that like I want to answer. I'm trying to figure out like, oh, what's like the history of like unemployment insurance reform in Minnesota, and then like trying to track that down. You can become like an expert in like these small tight little areas, and then figure out a lot of cool stuff.
Yeah, I'd like to second the there's more than one way to be an economist vibe of what you just said, because I think PhDs aren't for everyone. Like you said, they're extremely competitive. And academic economics isn't the only economics. I mean, I'm somebody who's done a PhD in economics, right? But probably going to leave academia despite that.
Yeah. I mean,
And yeah.
it's very funny because, like, and I think, I have a master's in economics, so I'm not, but like, I like when the person asked me about the research frontier, like, the great thing is, like, if we're doing policy relevant work, you probably shouldn't be at the research frontier. Like half of what's at the research frontier is going to be wrong, but a lot, like, there's a lot of stuff that you can find. The 10-year lag and the 20-year lag has a lot of good stuff in it.
Yeah, I actually think,
You don't
yeah,
need to
that's a
learn all the
really, really good
machine learning
point.
stuff.
Sorry, Matt, go ahead.
Oh, and I was saying you don't have to like learn all like the most fancy like novel econometric stuff, which like no policymakers are going to understand either, and will find compelling.
Yeah, oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, like I think yeah, you're not really. I think one of my frustrations with academic work actually is that you're not really at the policy relevant level yet, and I think it's for certain people, certain types of people to do who kind of like that type of work. But I actually think I'm much more concerned with being engaged with the real world,
Yeah,
which is why when you're reading the fifth paper on identification of instrumental variables and stuff, you're kind of like, oh god, you're just sort of drifting from anything that's relevant, and knowing that, like you said, like half of it's probably wrong, and that's not to diss that work at all. Like you said,
no, but I
it's
mean, research is
necessary.
really hard. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it's and like again, like that's like I was saying, like the Golden and Rouse orchestra paper or the Card and Kruger minimum wage paper,
Mm.
like those papers had a lot of flaws in them, but they were the research frontier at the time, and they built this entire literature around them. So like the papers that are coming out right now that are really exciting, like maybe some of those have a literature built around them, or maybe some of them are like, oh yeah, like that was a really cool finding that didn't end up going anywhere.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Okay, so I reckon we've been going for actually 2 hours now. So it's
Great,
been really great talking to you. We've had a big audience. I think it was peaking at over
fantastic.
500. It's still at about 400. So yeah, it's attracted a lot of attention. This, and it's been a really interesting discussion. So thanks so much for coming, Matt.
Great. Thanks. And I'm going to take a little break, but I'll probably go and be on Twitter in 10 minutes or so. So I'm happy to, if anyone out whose question didn't get answered or has something else, I'm happy to respond to you there. So you can
Yeah.
reach me on Twitter at Trousers.
Yeah, yeah, that's at best trousers. Yeah, that's Matt's Twitter account. So ask him or me if you've got any further questions. This will be unlisted because of the bloody algorithm. Then I will, so it'll still be available. You can find it on my playlists under Econ Conversations, but I will also upload it to Unlearning Economics Live. And I will also upload it as a podcast when I finally get around to doing that. But thanks everybody, and I'm going to end the stream now. See you later.